Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So thanks very much for joining the Q members webinar, which is a really good opportunity for us to hear and reflect on some of the emergent evaluation findings. So my name's Matthew Hill. I'm the Insight Evaluation and Research Manager at Q, and I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Tom Ling, who's the Senior Research Leader and Head of Evaluation at RAND Europe. And he's been leading RAND's work on the evaluation of Q.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
We've been working really closely over the last 5 years, actually, on RAND's external evaluation of all our work. And we're at a really exciting point because pretty much all the data has been collected, and RAND are just at the stage of pulling together the kind of final analysis, which will go into the final report published in a few months. So actually, it's a really good opportunity today for RAND to be able to share some of those emergent findings, but also, you know, they're still at a stage where they can kind of be tested and refined. So it'd be really interested to hear how they're kind of landing with all of you on the call. Before I hand over to Tom, I'll just go through a few technical points. So we've muted everyone to avoid kind of background noise. I guess the same goes for the cameras. So we've turned those off. That should just improve the kind of connectivity. We will be recording the webinar. That's really so that we've got a kind of document of what's been said, but it'll also allow us then to share it with those people who wanted to join the webinar but were unable to. If you do have any technical issues throughout the webinar, please do write them in the chat box. We will try and respond to them. But if not, often the best thing is to kind of log out and log back in as usual with these things. And in terms of the chat box, that's how we'll be running the kind of participation and engagement of you throughout the webinar. If there is something that you really want to kind of articulate, we can always try and unmute you individually, but by default, we're going to run it through the chat box. So do please chip in on that. I can see that some people have already been saying hello and introducing themselves there. And actually, just as a bit of a way of kind of breaking the ice for the webinar, but also to test some of the technology around the chat function, we've just got a really quick icebreaker. So it is, we want you to think about what your Q year resolution is. So forgive the pun, but just have a think, I guess, about what is it that you want to start doing or kind of stop doing this year in relation to Q. Like I say, just have a quick think for 30 seconds or so. Once you've got a nicely formed idea, please do just type it into the chat box. Like I say, just it's a good way of testing that that's working for everyone. So we'll just have a quick think, then I'll share mine, and then we'll take a few from people who've joined the webinar. Okay, so I'll start. So we've got a couple coming through. So I think my Q year resolution is to think about how we can, I guess, in the evaluation, kind of more actively integrate actually improvement methods into some of the work we do around evaluation. And then we've heard from Darren, who says probably to engage with Q more, as I've not really done much in the last year. We might hear from Tom about there's a lot of appetite amongst Q members to kind of engage more than they've been able to for various different kind of barriers that they're facing. Wendy says, look to see where Q can be more embedded in our AHSN work, promoting applications and refining what people in the GMEC area want for support. And Matthew Hill, so I think there are two Matthew Hills on the call. We have finally tested the space-time continuum by being on the same call at once. So Matt says, I'd like to keep following Q's progress after our evaluation ends at RAND. I think that must be someone else joining under my alias. I'm not sure who that is. There is another Q member called Matthew Hill who I thought that might be, but it must be someone joining in on my link somehow. Okay, so great. So a few people have been able to use the chat function there. Like I say, that's how we'll run the kind of comments for the rest of the webinar. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to take us through some of the emergent findings.
That's great. So thank you, Matt. I'm looking forward to finding out who the mystery Matthew Hill might be. But apart from that, today's webinar, what we'll try and finish certainly before 3 and hopefully a good bit before 3 at 10 to or so. But I just wanted to share some of our approach and main findings. And I'm interested in, at this point where me and the team are pulling together our conclusions, just to be able to talk those through with you and hear what sense you make of those and what you might find is helpful and what you think is confusing. All of that would be really useful, as well as if we're just missing something. So do chip in through the chat box, but there'll also be explicit pauses as we go through to make sure that we harvest your insights on this. If we then just go on to the next slide. For those of you who don't know RAND Europe, we're a not-for-profit policy research entity. We work in the public interest. We've collaborated in one way or another with the Health Foundation for, I'm thinking, 20 years now, in my case, certainly. And obviously, we've been involved in the evaluation of Q from the outset. The evaluation itself, our approach has always been, and this was explicitly asked for in the original request for responses from the Health Foundation, it was to be an embedded evaluation that we would work alongside and closely with. So what isn't mentioned here are the large number of, particularly early on, the number of meetings that we would go to, I would go to with the implementation team, obviously attending all of the national events and some of the regional events, and getting immersed in the culture and flow of Q. And in so doing, moving from being a stranger amongst Q members to over time becoming a friend, I hope. And we've also reflected hard on what that implies for being an independent evaluator, and how we ensure that despite being friendly to the aims of Q, we seek to also be quite independent in terms of the analysis and the evidence that we present. That evidence is coming through a very large number of interviews with members, and then in the last couple of weeks with external experts like Don Berwick and others. 20 focus groups with members, the Q team and other stakeholders, continual review of the new documents coming out, 3 rounds of citizens ethnography with members, 5 workshops with the team, and 7 annual member surveys, slightly more than annual, I suppose, but member surveys, which gives us enormous confidence that we understand the world of Q and the challenges you face and the enthusiasms that you share and the activities that you enjoy and those that you don't engage with. And so we feel that we've got a really strong understanding of what it is like to be a Q member, and that was always an important part of what we were seeking to do, but to have good, where necessary, quantitative evidence to back that up. If we look at, I just wanted to appraise you of the headline findings from the most recent survey, which we're just finishing analysing now, because that hasn't been public up until now, and I thought you might be interested. Thank you very much to all of those who the headlines are that members are spending a similar amount of time on Q over time, that's meant to be, although that in most cases you're saying you'd like to dedicate more time in the future. So the participant on this project, he said there, Darren, I think it was, saying you'd like to engage more in the coming year. That's a very typical question point. And one of the things I'd like to get back to in our discussion at the end is how would such opportunities be created? How can time be created? Time is another word for priorities, I think, and permission from senior management. And so we want to, I really appreciate your thoughts on how we make that time a reality rather than a Q year's resolution. That was very cheesy. Secondly, members are frequently reporting that the resources that are offered are really useful. They like the communications they get. They value the connections that they're able to form, and they're using online learning resources. Nobody uses everything, but most people are using something in the respondents. Obviously, some are those that there may be some people who are not engaged at all that didn't respond. Members generally feel that Q is being part of Q is beneficial, and the resources, the information that they have, they would not get in other ways, which is quite interesting. Bearing in mind that at the outset, a lot of the people that joined Q were not people who were part of the usual suspects of improvement. They weren't going to IHI events. They weren't going to the BMJ events on improvement. They weren't part of that community. There's a lot of new energy, previously untapped energy, that is coming in here, and they find it helpful. The majority of members are confident that it impacts positively, which one would hope certainly, but positively on their ability to undertake improvement work. A word that comes across there quite often is confidence. People feel more confident to act in their organizations to support improvement. And that the experiences of Q Exchange were largely positive. A certain anxiety about the popularity contest that it involved, and it may, despite the evidence to the contrary, there's a worry that it might favor those with larger networks. Those are all pretty positive. I do want to say some things which are not exactly negative, but are highlighting an area where Q will need to progress in the next 10 years. And I want to reinforce that point later on. But moving on just to the next slide, which, here we go. I was asked by Penny, or rather reminded, that it'd be really helpful in this final evaluation, which technically doesn't include the very first year, the co-design year, but the point was made that it'd be really a missed opportunity not to talk about that. And so we do want to include something on that first year, which I think was audacious, as somebody used on the evaluation advisory group. I think it's the right word. It was not guaranteed to work. It required, I thought, some real skills and leadership, but also it required being able to tap the genuine enthusiasm, interest, and passion for improvement that those first 300 members brought with them, from a wide range of backgrounds, a wide range of skills. They evolved a shared, not without some arguments, but they evolved a shared approach and a shared and branded identity. This showed how the NHS, when it creates the opportunities for inclusive engagement and builds really helpful, effective structures for engagement, that NHS, people in and around the NHS, including patients, are very keen to get it to engage if they believe it will improve the NHS and if it will improve outcomes for patients. And that first year, therefore, tapped all of that. We also heard earlier about engaging with the HSNs, and that first year showed how Q might sit within a wider organizational landscape. I want to come back to that because that's probably still an issue which is to a degree unresolved. Two consequences merit reflection from this first year. That the fact that in the course of the year, participants valued tacit, informal, or experiential knowledge over this, quote, science of improvement. I again want to come back to this. Is this something that going forward we are comfortable with? Or do you in fact agree with that, that there is, that engagement with the science of improvement is less than it might be or less balanced? But that's an interesting thought, and it's a challenge that I've been given from a few external experts. And secondly, building a community that could bridge and bond internally was privileged over an overt engagement with national government priorities. There was an anxiety that Q would be co-opted by senior management to deliver national priorities. Now that Q has matured to the point that it has, do we want to rethink that question about the relationship between national priorities and the Q community? So there's two questions that we will come back to towards the end of this discussion. And then moving on. taking that together, and especially the 2019 survey response, this is a very a strongly positive picture. I know it's an expensive intervention, but this was not guaranteed to work in my view. There's much to be positive about, but there are certain tensions that still persist. I think I would argue that these tensions are largely inevitable, and they are creative tensions rather than destructive tensions. But nevertheless, they're tensions that we should reflect on. And the first is the question about, is Q about being incredibly creative and generating new ideas? Or is it about changing the routine and improving the routine day in, day out work of the NHS? Or indeed both. But where do you think that balance might lie? And I mean, any comments that you want to add to the chat room, please do. And for me, there is something about the rhythms of learning that are really important versus searching for the next new thing. I was doing some work unconnected to Q in another part of the country, looking at length of stay, and the next new thing was really interesting. They were constantly churning with bright new ideas, but my feeling was there was insufficient time to focus on one or a small number of improvement approaches and really get a rhythm of learning that would take you through. But we want new ideas, but we also want a rhythm of learning. How do we balance that out? A different but sometimes related question is the balance between top-down and bottom-up. How do we get this hybrid connection between national priorities and a social movement that is passionate and creative around improvement? And that, again, is an interesting question. We kept coming up either overtly or tacitly to this idea of, is Q great at bridging between people who would never normally talk, because it does loads of that, and we've got quite a lot of evidence on that, or is it about bonding people that are already involved in improvement and creating stronger relationships, or obviously both? There's an expression that Helen Bevan uses, which is that if you're an improver, you have to be able to rock the boat while staying afloat. Although I'm sure she says it rather better than that, but how do you be a disruptor at the leading edge, but still drive the ship of the NHS stably forward and in a safe way? You can't disrupt too much without there being risks to patient safety. But there again, you need to experiment and push the edges out. And so my key question would be how to balance all of the above with a visible responsiveness to system priorities. I believe that there's some further work for us collectively to do, or for Q to collectively do, to talk about building a space where this is negotiated and agreed with system leaders. And that should be done by Q members in their organizations, but also arguably from Q leadership as well. I'm going to pause in just a moment to try and get some feedback just after the next two slides. And this slide that's in front of you now is my attempt to, this sits within the theory of change. It's not an alternative to the Q theory of change, but this is where what we're getting from people is that what Q is doing and what they are seeking to do as improvers is to be more creative and curious about their work, creating a space for creative reflection. From that, to step outside of their daily routines and engage with new evidence, new ideas, new people. And armed with that, identifying new ways of working and adapting and mobilizing existing knowledge connected to the system priorities, and then establishing new routines of working, which then get habituated. And in my reading of 7 annual surveys and the focus groups and so forth, is that that lies at the heart of what I'm hearing Q members do when they do improvement. Unfreeze, engage, connect, create new ways of working in a rhythm of learning. And if we look to the next slide, what is Q specifically good at doing in relation to that process? And that is that it bridges and bonds, it creates new relationships. That comes across really strongly. The self-efficacy, confidence, it comes across really strongly. What do I get from Q? I get a degree of confidence that I didn't have previously to talk about improvement and engage with others. I believe I can make a difference. That confidence means I engage with new approaches and then go to national events, go to regional events, go to site visits, look at the evidence that's online from Q, so on and so forth. And I'm trying to bring that into connecting to the system priorities and needs. And that, I'm going to pause now, but my question, as in pausing, is very much about this last bit, connecting to system priorities and needs. The pushback I've had from external experts who are leaders in QI around the system is Q is doing these first bits brilliantly, bridging and bonding, safe places, self-efficacy, big thumbs up, really exciting, really interesting. How is that going forward and negotiating a space for meeting system needs with chief executives, with boards, but also up to Simon Stevens himself and so forth. And that's really where some of the challenge of the coming 10 years, where we believe, lie.
Okay, fantastic, Tom. So we're just going to stop for a few moments there and just allow a bit of time and space, an opportunity to kind of reflect on what we've heard. So it'd be really helpful if people could kind of chip in with comments or questions or reflections in the chat box. I guess we're open to any questions. So any questions, this is your chance to ask Tom. But I guess particularly we're interested in reflections on what you've heard so far. Does it make sense? Is it a kind of helpful framing? Is there anything that really chimes with your experience or anything that kind of jars particularly with your experience? And I should say we are quite a small group on the call, so there's only around a dozen of us. So we are relying on people to chip in on the chat box. We'll just give people a couple of minutes to kind of formulate their thoughts, and then please do kind of put it into the chat function. Just while we're giving you a bit of time to kind of type those in, Tom, I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the point about self-efficacy and some of the kind of dimensions of that. I think you did start touching on a few, but I'd be really interested to hear what actually is it then that
I was very taken
underpins that self-efficacy.
Yeah, I was very taken by the importance of confidence that we got, the way that Q provides members with more confidence. And I started to reflect on that, and I began to think a little bit about the idea of habitus and how we all inhabit a world that we've worked very hard to create, and we abandon that world with a certain amount of resistance, because this is a world that often we benefit from and we've got status in and so forth. So forcing ourselves to rethink the world that we're in is difficult, and that's partly about stimulating curiosity, but it's also, I think, supported by having some real confidence in your willingness to entertain the possibility that you're wrong in what you're doing, and that the way that you've been working is wrong. And how would we address that? How would we improve that? That without self-efficacy, without the feeling that you are entitled to reflect on how to improve and that it will make a difference, without that, I think that you won't get improvement taking place. You won't get engagement with improvement. And the workforce question around how do we unleash the potential of the workforce within health and social care, I think the answer to that is that if people don't feel self-efficacy, if they don't feel confident, then we won't make much progress, and that therefore I would place quite a high value, impossible to monetize or to quantify, but I would place a high value on this idea of increasing self-efficacy and increasing confidence for people working in and around healthcare.
Great. Okay, so we'll take the comment from Wendy. Please do keep feeding in any kind of comments or questions you have. Actually, this in a way builds on what you were saying around self-efficacy. It's almost the flip side of it. So Wendy says, I feel there needs to be more of an overt mandate for involvement from NHS England and improvement back into organisations. So this kind of permission to improve through Q community involvement. Wendy feels that the value is there for the individual, not so sure it's recognised by organisations themselves if they have Q community members working for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Wendy, I really agree with that. And that's one of the challenges, one of the big challenges moving forward. And what we know is that QI, the profile of QI, has both increased in visibility and in the positive attributes that it's seen to have over the last 5-6 years, not only because of Q, but partly because of Q. And that's being reinforced by things like this institute and other developments. That general change in profile does not appear to drive the behavior of the leadership of our health organizations in many cases. And that what's not happening is that people who are charged with transforming primary care or delivering improvements in length of stay or whatever it might be, that what is not happening is that they're not saying, my first port of call is to go to my Q members, because this is a fantastic resource of people who understand how to improve these systems and to engage with them. So I did some work last year looking at transforming primary care in London. At no point was Q mentioned in that. Actually, I know that's primary care as well, where there's even less visibility. I did some other work on reducing length of stay. Q wasn't mentioned, even though I knew that there were Q members in that organization. So how do we make that step forward that Wendy's talking about to give it both visibility and practicality, that this is not an additional burden on senior management that they need to also engage with another group. This is a resource of highly motivated, skilled people with existing connections that can drive forward change. And so I think that is about communication and engagement and making management at that level more aware of what Q can provide for them. You may take the view, and I'd be interested, that this means that Q would get overly institutionalized. And I recognize the problem with that, which is that Q is also a social movement of creativity and engagement, and you don't want to lose that. But my view is that unless it's demonstrably moving into that space in the coming 10 years, I think that will be a major problem for Q if they don't do that.
Right. So I think, again, you may have started to kind of touch on the response to this. So this is a question from Faye, which relates to one of the kind of key tensions you were talking about on one of the previous slides. So Faye says, you talked about pushback questioning of Q's work so far to link appropriately into priorities. She wants to know, were the respondents who felt this shouldn't be a priority, i.e. allowing the community to define priorities rather than the wider system, or did everyone agree that Q should work on closer alignment?
Great question, Faye. Look, very, very significantly, I mean, there was a significant group that did and still believe that Q is about this creative bonding community that will drive forward improvement. And I really get that. And I think that I called, using somebody else's term, I called Q an audacious initiative. And I would still hold to that. And it's been remarkable at being able to mobilize and motivate. So, and that is because it hasn't simply been an adjunct to NHSI. However, I think what I'm saying is that the balance of the feedback, and particularly from more external people from outside from outside Q, is that they're thinking about how do you bring this energy and creativity into the priorities. And I just want to make it clear, if I didn't make it clear, I prefer the language which is about how can we negotiate a space within which Q engages, rather than how can we do a deal in which Q supports priorities, system priorities. And I think that's that's quite an importantly different language, because the key priorities currently articulated over the next 10 years are about moving upstream, preventive work, working across health and social care. These are not, and all our Q members agree with these. The question, but there is a genuine negotiation about how should that be done. And so I would, if I implied that the route forward was for Q to be co-opted, that is not the language that I would begin to use in this context. It would be, how do we and create a space within which we negotiate that relationship.
Great, okay. So we've got a few more kind of comments and questions coming through. I think what we'll do is we'll just take one more here and then we'll move on and come back to some of the other comments a bit later, if that's all right. But do keep kind of feeding in the comments as we go. So we'll just take this question from Matthew, which I guess the findings you've presented have been quite kind of, I guess, overarching in terms of the evaluation. Matthew wants to know, were we able to conclude anything about the kind of optimal specific ways that Qs can receive the new ideas and approaches? You know, so is it national Q events, local ones? Is it Q visits or Zoom calls? Is it blogs, journals, or I guess so it's more of that kind of like precise, specific mechanisms by which Q operates.
So we haven't done what would be a discrete choice experiment around how people would trade off amongst those. Interesting though that might be, what we can say with real certainty is that different members are energized by different products, if we can use that term, from Q, and some, especially, I mean, the people in North Wales that we interviewed, that their main connection is the online facilities to get libraries, and they're not linked to anybody else, but they really appreciate that. Others, it's the site visits. Clearly, Q Exchange was very exciting for some people. Q Lab was a transforming experience for some people. So, Matthew, the answer to that is a bit tricky, which is that it really does seem that it's horses for courses, and that people, different members are energized by different opportunities to engage. And what you can begin to see that certain things just are less used, and so that becomes a kind of indicator. I would be reluctant, so I think just continue with the suite of offerings, vary that over time, and where it's clear that some things are really not being used, I would let them wither. I don't think our evidence can allow you to say, all right, we should increase by 50% the resource going to site visits and decrease other things. I'm sorry, that's not a very helpful answer, but I think that is the case.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. So like I say, we've got a few comments coming through. We'll return to them at the end, but I just want to make sure Tom's got time to get through the presentation. And like I say, we will get through to the all of those comments, so do keep them coming through. Okay, I'm going to pass back to you, Tom.
Right, okay. Really just a couple of concluding comments. One is that I'm interested, I think that we've been implicitly conceptualizing Q in ways that draw upon a range of theories. And I think at some point, whether in the report or in an annex, probably at least briefly in the report, we ought to reflect on what is this underpinning theorizing. The first thing is that we started at the very first meeting with the Health Foundation talking about the idea that probably bridging and bonding capital, social capital, would be an interesting conceptualizing approach, that Q both creates more intense connections between people who already know each other and creates the opportunity for linking to new people. Having not really run with that for a couple of years, it's increasingly clear that actually it's a concept that really does resonate and seems to work and does describe a lot of what Q is doing. Secondly, bearing in mind that Q absolutely should not be theorized as an intervention. Nevertheless, there's something about Carl May's normalization process theory, which normally would be applied to interventions, but in this case, if we just to use a less technical language than Carl does, I would say that it poses 4 questions. How do people know what Q is? When they engage with Q, what do they think their role is, and how is that constituted? What do they think success would look like for them and for the organizations that they're part of? And when they see difficulties, do they know what to do? So this is really drawing on more of an implementation view. But I think it poses interesting questions, and it has helped us to think a little bit about how do people engage with Q, what do they think they should be doing? Do they think they're a member that is receiving a service, or are they partly working with others to deliver a social movement of change? Those sorts of questions have underpinned some of our thinking, although not directly in the way that Carl May would have used. Very much more recently, I think this idea about habitus has been important. The habitus is particularly for people working in health and social care, where they have developed certain responsibilities and authority through developing the skills that they have, and they build a world around them which they benefit from, and which it's difficult for them to abandon and unfreeze unless they've got real confidence. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier about some of what I think is quite an interesting set of ideas, which originate in the work of Bourdieu. It also highlights the fact that, contrary to what some people have told me, which is that the science of improvement will mean that improvement gets easier, I think it reminds us that improvement will always be difficult. We'll have more knowledge about how to do it, but having knowledge won't make it easier. It will remain a difficult, tricky, awkward thing because people are habituated in their worlds. Just in passing, I think, like many of you and many others in the world of evaluation, the recent work that the Medical Research Council has been doing around implementation and evaluation in complex systems has also been helpful and very relevant for us. And I think that's a big improvement. But to understand your role as an evaluator in a process of complex change, that you are part of that process of change in itself, reinforces our original instinct that we were interested in being an embedded evaluator. So what does this tell us about the next 10 years? And then I'm going to pause. And this is that the question about organizational system priorities, we need to find more creative ways of thinking about that. That is about relational structures to negotiate and work with. That is not simply absorbing priorities from above. And I think there's something interesting in that. I've called that hybridity elsewhere. I'm not sure that's the right word, but it's something to do with that. I think that the role of transformation and innovation will be very important in the coming years, and that's beyond process improvement. That's about transformational improvement, and there's a debate to be had about how members engage with that. In doing all of that, membership composition will need to evolve, and that's understood. There'll be new powerful players coming in, STPs, ICSs, primary care networks. These are all going to create both new challenges, but more typically, they create new opportunities for engaging with transformation and improving systems. And Q Labs, I think, offers something really new and really exciting. Where will they settle in relation to Q? That's more of an interested question over time. That's for others to resolve. But they'll be interesting to see how that works. Clarifying relationships with building and mobilizing a knowledge base, and therefore with that science of improvement, where does Q sit? And what's the balance between, shall we say, fluffy, warm, cuddly, supportive stuff, which I don't demean any of those words. I think they're all, in the current vicious climate, really important. But where does that sit with the hard science of improvement? Governance and leadership has been widely approved of the current queue. That will need to continue to evolve and balance, particularly as scale increases. And that poses particular problems. We've seen smaller organizations growing rapidly and failing to develop the governance arrangement needed to facilitate that. And we want to highlight that. And we also want to encourage more of a visible shop window for Q, so that chief execs, Simon Stevens, all of that group can visibly see what Q can do for them. And yep, that's me. I'm in pause now.
Great, thanks very much, Tom. So we've got another opportunity now. I guess we've got about 10 minutes or so left. So it's another opportunity to kind of feed in any reflections. You know, we'd be particularly interested in hearing how, I guess, some of those theoretical perspectives landed. Were they useful? Do they help kind of illuminate some of the dimensions and challenges of Q? Just while people are kind of reflecting on that and sharing some of those comments, we've got a few comments left to pick up from the previous pause. And actually there's 2 or 3 that still relate to the issue we discussed around system priorities. So I'll just go through those 3 and then you can respond, Tom, if that's all right. So Joe said, what do the senior leaders you've spoken to believe the role is for Q to enable organisations to create these enabling conditions? And what should we be doing to connect better to system priorities? What's the role of other organisations? And then Wendy reflected on that tension around system priorities. I think as most organisations and individuals have a finite amount of time to give to QI, that aligning them up with national plans and priorities makes for more synergy rather than potential view of separateness. And then Darren said that I would say that if on the ground QI initiatives are not reflecting national system priorities, it might be something to consider as part of the priority setting process rather than the QI process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think what we're being told is that the first thing is not that Q is doing the wrong thing, particularly, but that its visibility is limited amongst those decision makers. So its ability to mobilize and galvanize and create a confident group of staff who understand and want to drive forward improvement. The point that's been made by a number of more, if you like, the system leaders, is that connection is not being readily drawn. And that therefore an opportunity that would create time for Q members to engage in improvement and give them resources to deliver that and would help senior leadership achieve their objectives is being missed. That opportunity is a missed opportunity. I really like the idea that if Q members are identifying priorities based on their experience and knowledge of the work they do, and those are not national priorities, it's not at all obvious that the problem is therefore that Q needs to change its priorities. It might well be that our national priorities need to adapt. And I think that's right. And that's why I was trying to use that language of creating a space within which there can be more of a negotiation around how to engage the skills and expertise and resources that Q makes available. Some of the national commentators I spoke to were really talking about, that Q is many things. It's a social movement, it's a network, but it's also a resource. And that as a resource, it is being underused by others. My point back on that was that shouldn't just be co-opting that resource to achieve the priorities of others. It should be a negotiated space where we try and work through what that might look like. That could be very exciting. But also, I can't remember who said, but it was that it's not the only improvement game in town. Clearly, there are, and that it was never intended that Q would replace IHI, and we've not talked about Scotland. I should have done that. but all the kind of resources. It was never intended that it should be an alternative to that, but indeed as a quite a flat, quite democratic, quite inclusive, quite cross-cutting resource that could support all of those and engage with all of those.
Okay, great. I'm just conscious of time. So we've had a few additional comments that I think if it's all right, we might pick up kind of one-to-one with people who've made those comments, if that's all right. But please do keep kind of chipping in any questions or comments, because Tom will take all of those away and kind of integrate them into the final stages of analysis. So we might just move on to the final section of the webinar, if that's all right, which is thinking about, I guess, next steps for the evaluation. So actually, I'll take these slides, if that is that. All right, Tom. So just to kind of give you an update on the next stages then for RAND's work. So the as I said at the start, the final evaluation report is being drafted pretty much as we speak. It'll be delivered to us at the end of January. And like I said, Tom will be able to integrate some of those kind of reflections and questions and, to some extent, challenges that people have fed in on the webinar. So that's been really useful. And then obviously that report will go through quite a substantial kind of review process, but should be ready for publication at some point in April. And what we want to do is kind of make sure that it is kind of accessible to members, but also to stakeholders outside of the membership. So we'll have the weighty in-depth report, but it'll be supported by a kind of one-page accessible summary, a 10-page summary, probably some kind of podcast or video where Tom kind of gets into, I guess, some of those more nuanced findings that we've been able to do on the webinar today, as well as disseminate the findings through kind of academic routes at conferences and journals. Because actually, a bit like Tom was saying, that because Q is quite a pioneering and audacious initiative, actually we believe there is quite a lot of broader kind of contribution to knowledge that we can make off the back of all of RAND's work. So I guess that was the final stages of RAND's work then. But what we want to do now in the last few minutes is just turn our attention, I guess, to the next steps for Q's evaluation more broadly. So thinking about the next 5 or 10 years and what should really be the priorities for Q's evaluation. So we did actually include a question on this in the most recent members survey. So that was completed hopefully by some of you a few months ago. It was just an open question that asked people to kind of feed in what they thought their priorities were, or our priorities should be for the future evaluation. We had over 100 responses, which was fantastic. So I'll just draw out a few of the key themes from that, and then we've got a bit of space before we close just for people to feed in any thoughts and ideas they have. So some of the key things that people thought we should focus on is firstly, really trying to link outcomes to specific activities. So I think this relates a bit to the question that Matthew was asking, which is really trying to understand what specific bits of Q, which specific activities or forms of engagement are really strongly linked to the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And I think related to that, it's also the kind of dosage or pathway, is there a particular way that members might engage that actually leads to some of those greater kind of outcomes than others? There's also the point around the greater evidence around the demographic breakdown of members. I mean, we've got very good data on kind of what that demographic breakdown is, but what we haven't done so much of is, I guess, link that to different needs of members, what the experience of different groups of members is and how that differs, and then again, how that's linked to kind of different outcomes that people might experience as a result of their engagement. I think also following on from that is just generally a kind of clearer link to Q's theory of change. Obviously, we've done quite a lot in this 5 years to, I guess, quite exploratory work around kind of refining and developing the theory of change. So I guess then it's moving on to, really test any of those remaining kind of assumptions within the theory of change. And then, I think we've, to some extent, got onto this in the webinar today, but exploring those wider impacts of Q, both on the broader kind of QI landscape, but all including on quality of care and impact on patients. How Q is aligned to the external context. And I guess in particular, there was quite a strong challenge from some of the comments around to really ask some of those hard-nosed questions, I guess, around what the added value of Q is and how it relates to some of those other kind of improvement initiatives. And then again, I guess, finally stressing that, I guess, more kind of harder-nosed approach is really understanding in quite a concrete and precise way the return on investment of Q. So I think from what you've been saying today, Tom, there's a good kind of value case for Q, but because we have secured this longer-term funding, I guess a bit of a harder-nosed approach for some members around that kind of return on investment. So like I say, some of what Tom has said today does respond, I think, to some of those points that people raised through the survey. But just in the last few minutes, it'd be really interesting and useful for us to hear from you about, having heard the presentation from Tom and having reflected on some of those key points that came out of the members survey. Are there any other key evaluation questions or approaches that you'd like to see in the future? And maybe if they do come through, I'll highlight them and we can always respond. But if not, we can just kind of record them and integrate them into our thinking about our future evaluation approach. So please do chip some of those ideas in. Darren says, I'm really interested to see bear with me one second, it just skipped down. Darren says, I'm really interested to see a breakdown of where people sit in systems. The last event I attended was very secondary care heavy. I'd like to find out more about Q in primary care, social care and public health.
Yeah. And if you went to an event in Scotland, you would see a broader range probably. But certainly, given the system priorities and given how Q is wanting to move out, as it expands its membership, it will also want to broaden that membership. So it's not just going to increase the numbers, but you're absolutely right. That would be about trying to ensure a much more adequate engagement from primary care, for example, which becomes much more credible and possible with primary care networks and different conditions of employment. Small practices, I've always found it really hard to engage with quality improvement, because, yeah, for obvious reasons. Larger units with a capacity to support their staff in a more consistent way around improvement, I think you'll see some changes. And once STPs get engaged with that same objective of improving population health, then you'll see that same kind of movement taking place. Yeah. So I think that's really absolutely right.
And I think if I've understood it correctly, I guess there's, in response to Darren's point, there's almost like there's the evaluation question, well, what is the breakdown of members? So like I say, I think we've got pretty good data on that. But then there's almost like, if this is what Darren is getting at, almost like empowering members then to have that information and use that information to then use it to kind of connect and identify with other members from different groups. And then we'll just take this, I think, as the last comment before bringing the webinar to a close. So when Wendy says, I guess some of it is what the future raison d'etre of Q is. Is this a person-centered individual QI development opportunity or a way of the whole system improving together? So in a way, it's another kind of key tension at the heart of Q. It could obviously be both, but this needs to be described more overtly so that individuals can frame this personally and professionally. So I don't know if that was included as a kind of tension, but it's kind of implicit throughout.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, and I think it is both. And I think indeed, if you just tried to do one, it would fall over itself. And that, but that is an area where we need to, or Q members will need to think about how do they articulate that and talk about that. My diagram of unfreezing through to system change it suggests that you have to have both of those. Otherwise, you just get frozen behaviors, and that whatever is coming down at the system level doesn't get reflected in changes that take place. That's been really interesting. And I mean, just a final word from me then is about, going forward over the next 10 years without RAND. I think it's absolutely the right thing. I think that it's really important that Q becomes, that we understand that evaluation is something that there are evaluative activities which are embedded in the improvement efforts that we're making. And that we have, it may be that you want to bring in additional evaluation skills here and there, and certainly that you might want to have, for reasons of accountability, a review after 4 or 5 years or something of that sort. But my view is that the way that it's proposed to go forward to embed evaluation within Q is exactly the right way and is exactly what we should be doing. So I'm really kind of very, very delighted to have enjoyed the journey so far and to be a very interested observer the journey going forward.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much, Tom. So we're going to bring the webinar to a close now. So I just firstly want to thank Tom for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we know that you and your team are knee deep in data at the moment and getting the kind of final report drafted. And also a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us on the webinar. Like I said, it was a small elite group that joined us today, but it's been really valuable kind of hearing your reflections and input on the emergent findings. And like I say, Tom will kind of take them back to his team to integrate into the final reporting. So we really appreciate you giving that time. You can always, you know, if there is anything else that you want to contribute, you can always contact me anytime about the evaluation. You'll be able to find my details on the Q website. Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye now.